On to our speakers for this evening. So we have got, first of all, Keith Beattie, who has worked in the museum and heritage sector in Northern Ireland for almost 30 years. He delivers community projects which explore local history through storytelling, drama, exhibitions, music, art and archaeology. Keith is no stranger to Portrush Heritage Group, having previously presented almost 10 years ago on the role of local men in the Battle of Britain. In 2018, Keith helped us steer us through the setting up of our Heritage Trail, and it is a testament to his contribution that we are continuing the development of this trail through the addition of our Young Explorers Trail. When we asked Keith about this talk, he said that if you were asked to tell the history of Portrush in 8 objects, what would you choose? You have access to every private collection and museum in the world, and you can walk in and lift whichever you like. What is more important to you, the value of the object or the story that it can tell? And will you agree with Keith's choices? Over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much, and thanks for making me feel so welcome. The history of Portrush in 8 objects. So it's not about the value of the object in a monetary sense, not necessarily about how famous or well known the object might be. It's what they represent, their story. So these 8 pieces will hopefully help to draw out the history, culture and character of Portrush, and what makes this place unique and special. So in that respect, it's not an all-encompassing history or a virtual museum. It's just a very personal expression of how I see Portrush in many ways. So I narrowed it down, man-made objects rather than natural phenomenon. Obviously I can't bring them to the talk, so it'll be pictures. And even then, some of these objects are immovable. One indeed is fixed to a wall. So everybody's 8 choices, as we know, will be different. So I guarantee you we'll disagree on what I've selected, but that's one of the things that historians like to do, start an argument. So, first of all is a pamphlet. It's called The Inquiry into the Consistency of Dr. Hutton's Theory of the Earth, with the arrangement of the strata and the other phenomena on the basaltic coast of Antrim by the Reverend William Richardson, and it's from the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy in 1803. You'll be glad to hear I'm not even going to start to explain the contents of the article, but there is a story behind it. The geological theories of Neptunism and volcanism. Now, the author of this paper was the Reverend William Richardson, who often spent his summers in Portrush. He became involved in a very prolific scientific argument that raged in the early 19th century, and this was one of the papers that he had published in the Royal Irish Academy. The debate marked an important period in the history of earth sciences. It raised tension between embattled geologists, and a rock feature at the seaside in Portrush was often the centre of all the attention. In early geological terminology, Richardson was a Neptunist. The name Neptunism is derived from Neptune, Roman god of the sea. Neptunists proposed that minerals in the ancient oceans crystallised together or precipitated to form the Earth's rocky crust. In essence, all rocks, they believed, were sedimentary. An alternative theory of the period, volcanism, is the basis of our modern understanding of geology. Volcanism takes its name from Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and volcanoes, and it accepts that some rocks were formed when sediments compacted over millions of years. These are sedimentary rocks, but it also suggests that others, such as basalt, were formed from volcanic activity and molten lava or magma, and that produced igneous rocks. Now, at one stage, an international debate among academics hinged on the presence of fossils in some rocks in Lansdowne Crescent. Now, fossils are typically found in sedimentary rocks, preserved in the sediment, which millions of years later becomes rock. The rocks at Lansdowne, these ones here, they look very like a rock called basalt, which everybody believed to be, well, the volcanists believed to be volcanic. Neptunists, such as William Richardson, argued in his scientific papers that if these were volcanic rocks, a fossil would never have survived. The molten lava would have incinerated the fossils. Therefore, as a Neptunist, he believed this was proof that basalt, or what looked like basalt, was a sedimentary rock and not volcanic. Eventually, the Neptunists were proved to be wrong. Volcanists successfully showed that the fossils in Portrush were originally laid down in sedimentary mudstone. This mudstone was later baked when it came into contact with an adjacent flow of volcanic magma. So this rock may have looked like basalt, but in fact, it was a sedimentary rock that had simply been cooked. So the fossils remained in the rock and it became cooked. And that's why they survived, because it wasn't actually hot enough to destroy the fossils. So I hope that's explained it well enough. It's difficult sometimes to get that across. The area is now known as the Portrush National Nature Reserve. It's illegal to remove any of the rocks, which is why I don't have any here tonight. But it's been an attraction from geologists all across the world. And that pamphlet that I showed you from 1803 and others by William Richardson and his contemporaries helped to illustrate the great debate almost 2 centuries ago and led people even today to Portrush to see these rock beds. Second object, a set of small moulds from an excavation at Coorstown. Now these are moulds for rods, pal staves, axes and chisels. Beautiful examples of artefacts discovered during the excavation at Coorstown. Almost 25 years ago, archaeologists found evidence of the largest Bronze Age settlement ever discovered in the British Isles, at Coorstown. The prehistoric village is more proof that the area in and around Portrush was an ideal location for people living on this island. The archaeologists arrived in Coorstown in 2001 to carry out a preliminary survey. The early exploratory archaeology had made them aware that there might be something of interest beneath the surface, and what they found, in fact, were traces of 74 roundhouse dwellings. And this was totally unexpected. Up until this point, it had been believed that Bronze Age people lived in small clusters rather than large settlements. By analysing charcoal samples, it was possible to date the majority of the houses to around 1500 to 1300 BC. Some parts of the village were older than others, but it's estimated that at one stage there were as many as 50 of these houses standing together in the settlement. And there was an abundance of evidence left behind by these people. Archaeologists were able to identify the outline of the ancient houses in the exposed earth. Cobbled paths were also found, and a large roadway which passed between some of the houses. As they carefully searched through the layers of soil, they collected 8,000 shards of pottery, 16,000 pieces of flint, a polished stone mace head, and moulds such as the ones in that picture to make bronze tools and weapons. No metal artefacts were in fact found. So in addition to the Bronze Age discoveries, archaeologists at Coorstown found material from the Stone Age and from the Iron Age, along with an early medieval ring fort and a souterrain. Nevertheless, the excavation team had only 10 months to complete their task before the developers moved in, and sadly this exceptional and unique site is now underneath 200 houses on Hopefield Road. But Coorstown is a perfect example why we should never make assumptions about our past or about Portrush. No one had any idea about this Bronze Age village, that it might exist on our doorstep or below our doorstep. So we should ask maybe the question about Mount Sandal as well. How long before an older site is discovered? Maybe in Portrush. Object 3. A stone cross from the Antrim Gardens just across the road. So we're moving through history here into the Christian period. One of the earliest documents to identify the village of Portrush is a taxation record from 1306, which reports a large church at a place called Portrossa. Some historians believe that the church is located somewhere in the area now known as Antrim Gardens. However, others suggest it was on the site of this hotel. This idea is backed by finds including large masonry and bones from a possible graveyard made during the construction of the houses during the 19th century. And there are even others who believe the remains of the ancient church are elsewhere, possibly extending beneath what is now Bath Terrace and Bath Road. In search for an answer in 2005, archaeologists excavated a trench across the Antrim Gardens and made a number of intriguing discoveries. A series of ovens were found, implying that the site was part of a large kitchen serving a major building. A previously unknown freshwater well was revealed, which was most likely the reason why early inhabitants chose that location. And thousands of sherds of pottery were also collected, helping to date the busiest period of habitation on the site to between the 13th and the 15th centuries. This also provided strong support for the idea that this may have been a busy ecclesiastical community at one period. So this large piece of architecture is sandstone. It was recovered from the site and appears to have been from a monastic or ecclesiastical building from the early medieval period. And it was possibly brought here from elsewhere and built into a large building, such as a church. And you can see on this face, the block are 5 equidistant holes forming up the shape of the cross. Further finds gave an insight into the people who lived here during other periods of history. Mesolithic flints from 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. From more recent times, bones from cattle, poultry, sheep and horses demonstrated a post-medieval farming community in Portrush. Isolated bone finds also suggested there were people who may have occasionally enjoyed eating deer and hare. As expected, fishing was also an important source of food for these people, and the site contained an abundance of metal hooks and some stone weights. And this is Antrim Gardens today, of course, and I think archaeologists would love to get back in there and maybe look for more clues and the chance of finding the old church, and hopefully those clues will still be there. Next, we have the grave of Dorothea Ross. Now, this grave represents how North Antrim did not escape the many upheavals throughout the history of Ireland. And this story, albeit an unsettling one, touches on domestic themes and also the arrival of a king to this part of the world. So the ruins of the old Ballywillan Parish Church are believed to date back to the 16th century. It was abandoned by its congregation in the 1840s when they moved to their new place of worship in Portrush, Holy Trinity Church. The best known headstone in the old graveyard marks the burial of Dorothea Ross, the Portrush princess. It said that Dorothea was the illegitimate daughter of the deposed British King James II. As we know only too well, in 1689, James was fighting a campaign in Ireland against William III. When he arrived in the north of Ireland, he briefly stopped in the town of Ballymoney. He took advantage of a young farmer's daughter, and she later gave birth to a child, a baby girl, Dorothea Ross. When James's illegitimate daughter grew up, she married a Coleraine merchant named Ross, and it is believed that she died quite young, possibly in childbirth. Now, the surface of the headstone has been worn away by centuries of coastal weather, and the only visible feature is a heraldic shield. Thankfully, the Ordnance Survey memoirs recorded what was legible in the 1830s. And they tell us that the grave reads, "Here lieth the interred body of Mrs. Dorothea Ross, wife to John Ross, of the town of Coleraine, a merchant, who departed her mortal life on the 11th day of December, Anno Domini 1713, in the 42nd year of her age." Now, this, of course, causes a mathematical puzzle, as it means that Dorothea would have been born in 1671, long before James arrived in Ireland. However, others suggest that the inscription has deteriorated so badly that it was misread as 42, when in fact it was 22, which then allows Dorothea to be born around 1691. Object 5, a director's pass for the Ballymena, Ballymoney, Coleraine and Portrush Junction Railway in 1855. So this object represents a critical event in the development of the town of Portrush, the arrival of the railways and all the benefits that are brought with it. There's no name on this copper token. It's believed to be a template for a free token for life pass presented to other directors by the great railway pioneer William Dargan, who owned the majority of the shares in the original company. Today, those of an age have the advantage of free rail travel. Back in 1855, in the days before a motor car, this would have been a wonderful endowment for the recipient. So work commenced on the Ballymena, Ballymoney, Coleraine and Portrush Junction Railway on the 22nd of September 1853. 2 years later, Portrush Station was opened on Tuesday the 4th of December 1855, and it had a single platform of over 90 metres. The line was later amalgamated into the Belfast and Northern Counties Railway Company. As it got busier, in particular with holiday traffic, the original station was replaced in the spring of 1893 with an impressive mock Tudor-style building designed by Berkeley Dean Wise. Now, with the arrival of the railway came tourists. Modern, affordable hotels and guest houses appeared in response to the demand for accommodation. Over the next 3 years, the railway companies added to their schedules, providing more carriages to hold the Victorian holidaymakers. As the Coleraine Chronicle reported in 1883, the old Portrush was long gone forever. The thatched houses have disappeared. An excellent harbour has been formed, and within a comparatively short space of time, the rude fisherman's village has shot up from a country wench into the likeness of a town belle. It has spread in all directions over the adjacent pastures, swallowing all gorse and hedgerows in stones and mortar. You see instead elegant villas and mansions, urban-like terraces of buildings, handsome churches, streets flanked with shops and other places of business. And groups of visitors promenade hither and thither, or sunning themselves by the sea. Portrush has become the Eastbourne of Ulster, the Portobello of the Northern Irish people. And better was to come with two exciting additions to the Portrush landscape: the electric tram in 1883, and most significantly, the golf course in May 1888. And golf was generating huge interest across the British Isles, and the popularity of the St Andrews of Ireland meant that yet more people wanted excursions to Portrush, and more trains were added to the timetable, even prompting a campaign by one Irish Times reader for a train to bring enthusiastic golfers directly from Dublin to Portrush. Object 6. Something maritime. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution Medal, awarded to persons whose humane and intrepid exertions in saving life from shipwreck on our coasts have been deemed sufficiently conspicuous to merit that honourable distinction. Now, the earliest RNLI award for bravery at seas off Portrush was a silver medal presented to William Richardson for a rescue back in 1842. According to a report in the Belfast Chronicle from the time, 4 men, Hugh Kelly, Adam Clark, James McAllister and Daniel Hamill, rounded Ramore Head on their way to lift creels when their boat was hit by a huge wave. Their boat was overturned. 3 of the men, Kelly, Clark and McAllister, were instantly lost to sea. Hamill managed to hold on to the shattered remains of the broken vessel. Nearby, William Richardson was aboard another small boat with a crew of 3 boys. All the boys were barely 16 years old. 2 of them, in fact, James and Patrick Kelly, had just witnessed their uncle Hugh being washed away. Nevertheless, they followed Richardson's instructions and made for the floundering upturned boat in appalling conditions, and they managed to rescue Daniel Hamill, and for this Richardson received a silver medal. In 1891, 5 more silver medals were awarded, followed by 2 others in 1916 and 1961. In addition, 2 bronze medals have been presented to Portrush men, the most recent in 2010 for Anthony Chambers, following his heroic rescue of 2 boys cut off from the tide in the cave at Castle Rock. So all those medals to Portrush men. Portrush Lifeboat is an integral part of the identity of the town, and these medals demonstrate the tremendous courage of our local RNLI crews. It should be stressed that in many people's opinions, those who volunteer regularly and have served on lifeboats in Portrush since the branch was formed in 1860 deserve a medal for every time they risk everything to save or come to the assistance of people in danger. Object 7 is a street sign, Rodney Street. So in Portrush, the street is an uncommon name. I think there's maybe only 1, possibly 2 elsewhere in Northern Ireland, Rodney Street. So the question, of course, is who was Rodney? What did he do to deserve a street named in his honour? Or indeed, what was Rodney? And in fact, Rodney was a ship, the HMS Rodney, a Royal Navy ship which stopped briefly in Portrush back in 1930. So while I could have chosen the actual ship, HMS Rodney, I selected instead for one of the 8 objects, the street sign, because it's a representation of the history that can be found in and around the town. And she was among one of the series of battleships that arrived here in Portrush over the years and commanded the view from offshore. In addition, HMS Hood was here almost exactly 100 years ago in July 1925, followed by a succession of other cruisers, frigates and battleships over the pre-war years, including Rodney's sister ship, HMS Nelson, in 1938. Back to 1930 and HMS Rodney. Now, she had been commissioned, and when she was commissioned, she was one of the largest battleships in the world. So it was quite prestigious for her to arrive in Portrush in June 1930 and caused huge excitement. Thousands of spectators braved unseasonal rain to watch her set anchor in the West Bay. A motor launch immediately set sail from the harbour to greet Captain A.B. Cunningham and his crew. On board the launch were Portrush's finest, including council officials and other leading residents. On their return, the officers of Rodney joined them, and they went to the ballroom in the Northern Counties Hotel, and plans were finalised for the week ahead. However, it was with disappointment that these plans had to be set aside the next morning when the notorious Portrush weather closed in. By Tuesday morning, Captain Cunningham believed he had no choice other than to take his ship back to sea. He sent a message to R.B. Adams, chairman of the council, giving his farewells. In response, Adam replied, "I refuse to say goodbye." Cunningham relented and Rodney remained at anchor. For the next 3 days, the Rodney was tossed around on a heavy swell which prevented any boats making the short trip to or from the shore. Such was the magnitude of the storm that 120 of Rodney's own crew reported to the ship's doctor suffering from seasickness. Finally, by the weekend, the sea was calm again. Portrush was now bathed in sunshine, and the crew could finally enjoy the hospitality of the town. To make them feel welcome, the ship's officers were presented with honorary membership of Royal Portrush Golf Club, and the crew members were given free passes for the Causeway tram to see the famous landmark. So among the activities, of course, performed that weekend by Captain Cunningham was the most important event of their visit, the naming of a street in honour of HMS Rodney. At that time, Rodney Street was the development of 28 modern houses on the Cracknamack Road, built by the local contractor H.E. Catherwood. The crowd who gathered to watch the ribbon-cutting ceremony enjoyed a hugely unique moment with a magnificent ship resting offshore as the street was given its historic new name. Captain Cunningham was presented with the ship's cat by Mrs. Gormley of Hopefield Avenue, a black Persian kitten which Cunningham appropriately named Rodney. So finally, Object 8. So for some fans, the TT is a time trial with riders starting at different intervals, whereas with its mass start and exciting road battles, Portrush and the Northwest in recent times for many has become the centre of the road racing universe. And the Northwest 200 is of course a motorcycle place that takes place between the towns of Portrush, Portstewart and Coleraine, and it began in 1929. The race takes its name from the location of the road circuit which was originally proposed by the first organisers. It was supposed to be held near the city of Londonderry on the northwest of Ulster. However, when the entire operation was unexpectedly moved to the Causeway coast, the name was kept the same. In addition, the prefix of 200 refers to the distance of 200 miles, and that's the distance over which early competitors were expected to race. And this was the case right up until the 1960s. Today, the race is a massive event with spectators and competitors coming from across the world and enjoying a week of racing each May. It's the biggest annual sporting event on the island, and Portrush has been seen as the focal point of much of the action since it began. Now, the inaugural Northwest took place, as I say, the 20th of April 1929, and the object I chose there was the programme. It was organised by the City of Derry and District Motorcycle Club. The race was held on public roads and ran for 18 laps over an 11-mile, 110-yard coastal circuit. 31 riders started the first race, only 8 completed it. That first year, riders did indeed start at intervals, although that changed in 1930 when bikes competed in races against machines of a similar size, and each race began with a mass start. The races were a big success, and the City of Derry Club agreed to organise the 1930 Northwest 200 straight on the back of it. However, at this time there was increasing tension within the club. Members from the Causeway area were feeling increasingly alienated. They felt that their contributions were being largely overlooked. Members from this area had secured the course on the Causeway for the first races after all, and they also provided 5 of the cups and the bulk of the £20 deposit to secure the roads for the race. They also indeed filled many of the important offices within the club committee. Now, everything escalated at the club's AGM in October 1929. Committee members travelling from the Coleraine area broke down in their car, and the Derry and District Motor Club refused to postpone or delay the meeting, and this meant that all from Coleraine and District lost their position on the club committee. Things happened quickly. The following day, a notice was issued in the press about the formation of a new club, and a few weeks later, a number of renegade members of the City of Derry Club, including a sizable contingent from Portrush, Coleraine, Ballymoney and Portstewart, met in the Corporation Hotel, Coleraine, and formed the North of Ireland Motor Club. The new club immediately created controversy when they decided to request permission to run their own race on the same circuit as the Northwest 200, 2 weeks before the Northwest 200. And they wanted to call their race rather grandly the Irish Grand Prix. So needless to say, it was always highly unlikely that both races would be allowed to take place within 2 weeks of each other on the same circuit. And eventually the City of Derry Club prevailed, and they were given permission to run the Northwest 200 on the 26th of April 1930. Permission was refused for the rival event by the North of Ireland Club point blank. But the dispute was not settled, and within weeks a new arrangement had been agreed. The 1930 Northwest 200 would indeed be run by the City of Derry Club, but the 1931 club would take place on the same circuit, and it would be organised by the North of Ireland Club. And then they would take a time about each year. Then, only a few weeks before it was due to happen, the City of Derry Club cancelled the Northwest 200. The club believed it would be impossible to run a successful event as they could not get enough motorcycle riders and their teams to attend. And this was just the kind of opportunity the North of Ireland Motor Club had been waiting for. They took control of the race and it went ahead, as planned, on the 26th of April 1930. The North of Ireland Club chose to keep the original name, the Northwest 200, and the Irish Grand Prix was forgotten. And you can see here some images from those early races. That's the Metropole corner, I believe, there just in the bigger picture. And a very different landscape, but you would have had probably the same levels of crowds. Thousands and thousands of people would have flocked here to see that race. And as I say, I chose the programme as the object. What I would have liked to have chosen would have been the Portrush trophy. I just can't find a picture of it. I believe it still exists with the North of Ireland Motor Club. And the Portrush trophy was presented in 1930, I believe, and it was for the 350cc class. And I think the first few of them were run by a Southampton rider called Eric Fernico. If that's how you pronounce that name. The 250cc class, sorry. And it still exists, to my knowledge. And it would have been nice to show you a picture, even just to bring it here and let you see it. But a bit of a mix there, a bit of a random mix. Maybe some people think of 8 objects and threaded through the history of Portrush. As I say, most people will probably disagree with me on some, if not all of them. But it's possibly something you'd like to try yourselves, even just to try and tell that story. There's no definitive list, but hopefully on some level, perhaps, I've helped to tell the story of Portrush and given it justice. So thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you so much. That really was a fantastic journey through Portrush, ending with a motorbike journey, which is probably quite suitable. Thank you again, Keith. Our second speaker this evening is Dr Nicholas Wright, and he is an archaeologist and social historian working for Causeway Coast and Glens Museum Service. He is currently the Ballycastle Museum Project Officer for the National Lottery Heritage Fund project to restore, extend and redevelop Ballycastle Museum. Regarding his talk, Nicholas commented that the Lore of the Land project was developed and delivered in partnership with Clanmill Housing Association between 2018 and 2019 as part of the Peace 4 scheme, supported by the special EU programmes body. Engaging with older residents from our 4 housing schemes, Abercorn Court and Mews, Cramsey Court, Glenchess Court and Heslett Court, the project stimulated reminiscence and discussion of local folklore. The contemporary stories were recorded and formed the basis of a book exploring and sharing cultural heritage through the folklore of Causeway communities. So thank you, Nick, if you'd like to take over.
Thank you very much. You can all hear me? Okay? Yeah. Perfect. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak. This is a project that I worked on, as you said in the introduction there, a few years ago. There's quite a lot of me reading quotes because I don't remember them off by heart. So if I'm turning away from you at the screen, that's why. It's nothing personal. Right, clicker. There we go. Yes, so this project, Lore of the Land, started back in 2017 as part of the Peace 4 programme. So a lot of you, I think, would be familiar with the Peace 4 programme. Funded by the Special EU Programmes body, it was pulled together, it was designed to foster good relations between different communities. As part of that programme, the Museum Service led a wider umbrella project called Understanding Our Area, where we worked with 18 or 19 different groups across the borough, working collectively towards exploring the heritage of the Causeway Coast and Glens as a way of understanding a joint past, if you like. Within the Museum Service, then, we led on certain projects ourselves, and one of those was this Lore of the Land project. We reached out and worked with Clanmill Housing in order to develop a folklore archive. So within Clanmill, we worked with 4 different schemes: Abercorn Court and Mews here in Portrush, Cramsey Court in Ballymoney, Heslett Court in Coleraine, and Glenchess Court in Ballycastle. Other groups that were working within this Understanding Our Area programme also contributed material to the Lore of the Land project. So Ballylough Living Heritage Group, Carry Historical Society, Harvey Heritage Group, and the Rathland Development Community Association all contributed stories to help flesh out what we had collected within this. So, what did we actually do? Throughout 2008, we had 4 different reminiscence sessions, one within each of the different Clanmill housing associations. At these, we sat down and we talked about local folklore, what stories people remember being told to them by their parents or grandparents, what things may have actually happened to them or that they had experienced themselves. Really there, we brought together believers, skeptics, and people who were completely agnostic. You know, a lot of people within these talks were happy to entertain the idea that things like ghosts or fairies might exist, but they didn't really want to have it proven to them. All right? And I think that's something that a lot of people can associate with. Our job within this program was to record these stories. We weren't there to prove them or disprove them. So we didn't go in there and question people, oh, really, what, you know, are you sure that's what happened? And look at other sort of explanations for it. We were just there to record it and create an archive for the future. Along with our 4 reminiscence sessions, we also had 4 site visits across the borough. We went to different sites that had some sort of folklore association. Mostly, in our cases, it was different ghost stories. The top left here is a site down near Glenallen that some of you may have heard of called Slactavity. And Slactavity was the home traditionally of a vampiric dwarf who came back from the dead and sort of terrorized the local area and became its tyrant ruler until he was slain several times and then buried beneath a yew tree. What we actually have is a fairy thorn growing up through a Neolithic monument. And there's various different stories associated, both with Avatak himself, this vampiric dwarf, and also with the folklore to do with the fairy tree, and people trying to remove the fairy tree and the various misfortunes that occurred after that. To the bottom left, then, we have Dungiven Priory. And at Dungiven Priory, really, we were exploring the story of Fionnuala O'Cahan, otherwise known as Finvola, the Gem of the Roe. And the story of the O'Cahan Banshee, and I'm sure most of you would be familiar with the song and with that story. At Dunluce, then, we explored the story of the McQuillans, the MacDonalds, and the various ghosts, banshees, and mermaids that are associated with Dunluce. And then we visited Bonamargie, out by Ballycastle, where partly we looked at the different ghost stories there, and also we focused on the stories of the Black Nun, who was a famous prophetess in the 17th century, supposedly either killed or fell down the stairs. There is a cross just at the end of the nave of the church there that is supposed to be her burial place. If you walk around the cross and then you put your hand through the center of it, she's supposed to sort of come back and give you a prophecy, but also said to haunt the site. So various different stories there. Moving then into 2019, we had various art workshops. So we had where our participants came together and, inspired by the different stories that we had explored, sort of made artistic representations. And then these would go on and illustrate the book, which I will talk about shortly. We then had editorial meetings as well, in which we compiled the stories that we had pulled together with other supporting information. So, part of our supporting information came from the Sam Henry collection. And I'm sure Sam Henry is no stranger to the people in this room. Sarah Calvin, the museum manager, I know presented on Sam Henry last year. But within the Coleraine Museum collection, we have more than 16,000 documents and photographs and objects that were collected by Sam Henry. That was loaned to the museum in 2010 and then formally donated to the museum in 2011. So Sam was a pensions and excise man. And as he said himself, in my contact with the old, who have all now passed away, I had the rare privilege of sharing their folklore and their old songs. So as many of you would be familiar, he went around as he interviewed people to assess them for what their pension should be. He collected their folklore and their songs. So he was doing this throughout the early part of the 20th century. So alongside our 21st century folklore, we were able to add sort of early 20th century folklore as well. And of course, a lot of what Sam was recording was from people who were born in the 19th century. So you can see the folklore that we're collecting is going back generations further. As part of Sam's work, he also went out and spoke at schools and got the schools to respond artistically to the different stories that he was telling. So there's some examples of some of the material that he collected up on the screen there, as well as one of his own publications on local myths and folklore. So all of this helped to sort of inspire what we were doing with the Lore of the Land project as well. Alongside Sam Henry and the reminiscence sessions that we had, we also combined other material that had been published previously. Some of that was our own museum service oral histories through other engagement projects. So the Rites of Passage project, 2014 to 2015, looked at traditions to do with births, christenings, weddings, and funerals. And of course, various things to do with either folklore, traditions, ghost stories, all came out in that. So we collected those stories. 2016 to 2017, we had the Big Houses project. And with the Big Houses project, we were interviewing people who had either grown up in big houses or had worked at big houses, or their parents were associated with big houses. And of course, what do big houses have associated with them? Ghost stories. Okay, so we had a lot of stories that we collected for that project as well. And these were on hand to incorporate into the Lore of the Land. Jim Hunter, who some of you may know, working with the Harvey Heritage Group, presented us with an unpublished folklore collection. He collected that in the 1960s when he was working as a teacher at Limavady. And he had sent his students home to talk to their parents and grandparents and collect their folklore. And he wrote it all down and then never managed to publish it. Nothing ever happened to it. So we got that. And if you had a look at the locations that our different Clan Mill participants were coming from, we didn't have anybody from west of the Bann. So what we had with Jim Hunter's work is filling out that sort of Limavady, Dungiven area, giving us that folklore from, again, sort of the middle of the 20th century. We also had published works by Elizabeth Andrews, Ulster Folk Tales, dating from 1913, so start of the 20th century, and then 2 articles in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology from 1857 and 1858 were the anonymous Fairy Annals of Ulster. And within the Fairy Annals of Ulster, we have stories that are being relayed to the anonymous author in the middle of the 19th century with people who had grown up perhaps at the end of the 18th century. So within this one corpus of local folklore, we were working from today right the way back to the late 1700s. In August of 2019, we then got together, so this is just down the road here, Abercorn Court and Mews, and we published the Lore of the Land booklet, or book. We have copies of it over at the front desk. On your way out, you're welcome to a copy. It's free, there's no charge. So do take that away with you and have a read. The book itself is broken down into 3 roughly equal sections. The first section is looking at the fairy folk, or the gentry. And so that's looking at folk stories related to banshees, leprechauns, that sort of thing. The middle section is looking at ghosts and hauntings. And then the last section is looking at witches and devilry, and the different stories to do with witchcraft and encounters with the devil. For much of the rest of the talk, I'll be picking out individual quotes and trying to string together sort of a summary of the sort of material you can expect to get within the book. Does that make sense? Everyone happy? Yep. Okay. A little bit of context first when we talk about fairy folk. Okay. Many of you will know that in Ireland, fairies do not look like our Hollywood fairies. Okay? We're not looking at small winged creatures. We're looking at people who are shape changers. They're unpredictable. They can be generous or they can be vengeful, and they're really renowned as tricksters. Okay? So fairies really are a way of explaining the unexplainable. You know, if you don't know why something's happened, a lot of the time in the past, certainly, it would have been said, well, that's the fairy folk who've done something. They're known by different names. They don't really like to be known as the fairies. Apparently, they prefer to be known as the gentry, or the gentlefolk. They're also known in Irish as the she, or the Ishi, that's the people of the mounds, sometimes known as the little people, or the wee folk. So we encounter in the book, and we explore different origin stories of the gentry or the fairies in Ireland. Jim Stewart, one of our participants, told the story that originally they weren't small at all. But what happened was when the Picts came, the Pictish people invaded Ireland, they drove these wee people into caves. They hunted them, and they lived in caves, and they got smaller and smaller and smaller, until eventually they were living in burrows in the ground, living under stones, and they became the wee people. Okay? So that's one of the origins. In the Fairy Annals of Ulster, so remember this is going back to the 19th century, they suggested that fleets of them came over from Orkney and Norway, sailing in eggshells. And it's the fashion still among the country people to teach their children, after they've eaten an egg, to run their spoon through the end of the shell, to prevent the gentle people using them again as boats to sail away from us. Okay. So if you think about this, this is written in the middle of the 19th century, and it's the older people relating these stories. So these are stories that are coming through from the 18th century. There are multiple stories about encounters with fairy folk. So Kevin McGowan spoke to his grandfather to get his impression on this. Kevin's grandfather said, "The gentry is something we don't often talk about. They do their thing, and we do ours. Sometimes you hear them. Often you see signs of them, but you never quite see them, and they're best left alone, son." So that's a contemporary view on the gentry. Another story is of Jack McBurney, who lived at the foot of Knocklade. He was sent word by a member of the gentry to change the location of the door of his barn. It had faced south, but the gentleman said that the noise and stir perplexed him at times. Jack changed the door to open to the north of his barn, and from that out, everything prospered with him, and there was no end to the prosperity he left when he died. So the stories come through again and again that if a small person approaches you and asks you to do something, you do what they ask. If an old woman comes to your door and asks for a glass of water or a glass of milk, you give it to her. Because if you do what the gentry ask, you're rewarded. If you don't, it's not so good for you. So Jim Hunter tells the story of a Limavady man who took a shortcut across a field. He climbed the gate and made for the corner of the field where he knew there was a stile. To his astonishment, however, he couldn't find it. After several minutes' intense searching, the stile was still nowhere to be found. He began then to suspect that the fairies were behind the mystery, and knowing that he was no match for their trickery, made his way back across the field to the road, resigned to walk the long way round. Going back to Jim Stewart again, he recounted that he used to live in Cushendun, and quite often I would walk along the hillside, and before I left, always brought a glass of whiskey with me. And just in Knocknagraw, there's ruins of an old house, and I always went there and I drank half the glass, and I poured the other half on the ground for the she. This particular day, I was walking along, heading towards the ruins of the house, and suddenly I was lifted up in the air, and there was a swirl and a swirl and a swirl all around me, and I couldn't move, and I was carried right up the pathway to the ruins of the old house and sat down where I usually sit. He went on to explain that I'd either walked into a morshul, that's a great parade, or I'd walked into a Torah, a funeral procession. But they, and he's talking about fairy folk, the gentry, lifted me gently and just carried me and set me down in the ruins of the old house, and then just disappeared.
Strong whiskey.
And of course, we have lots of stories, and you'd be familiar with many of them yourself, that if you damage a fairy dwelling, that misfortune is sure to come. So Margaret Huey said that on the Kirk Road between Ballymoney and Strenocum, there's a big farmhouse down the lane, and it sits on the right-hand side going down, and the farmer started to clear it away. And all the beasts started to die, the cattle. They wanted it all flat for grazing, but they had to leave it. To this day, you can see the bit where they dug out. It's grew over with grass, but it's not smooth on this side next to the road. Kevin, again, told the story of a farmer from the Glens who'd wanted to clear his ground and make a mountain path, but in the middle of it stood the fairy thorn. And after not returning home for tea, the wife set out for him. He was found lying at the foot of the tree with his arm clamped immovable around the saw. He suffered pain in his right hand for the rest of his days. We also explore the idea of changelings. This is the idea, of course, that the fairy folk will come and take away the children and leave a sickly changeling in its place. According to Jim Stewart, the fairy folk had a preference for healthy boys. They steal away wee boys. That's why they dress wee boys as girls. For a long time now they did, They always dressed them as girls up until about 5, the age of 5. Now, I can say, obviously you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. Originally from Australia. My grandfather, who also grew up in Australia, there are photos of him as a baby dressed as a girl. Okay? So the traditions carried across out to the colonies as well. Didn't stay here in Ireland. From the Sam Henry archive, we get the story relayed to him by Katie Glass of Rathlin. Katie spoke about a wee lad of 5 or 6 he was. He was taken away by the fairies. A week went by, and no matter how hard they searched, his parents could discover nothing of him. Then, in what Sam Henry refers to as, quote, a remarkable instance of an animal medium linking this world to fairyland, a large sheep brought him back to their door and left him home without a bleat out of her. So after introducing these stories about fairies and the different sort of traditions around them, their different personalities, how they come across, we then look at the different types of fairies. Because like people, not all fairies are the same. Some of the types of fairy that we looked at would be very familiar, others, I suspect, would be less so. Banshees, of course, are sort of renowned world over. Helen McCaughan told this story of encountering a banshee. When she died, the banshee climbed up a pole. It was white, no face or nothing. It was just like a sheet, and she wrapped around, and I looked and I thought to myself, am I seeing things? And she wailed. She went on wailing and wailing, and the next thing I heard, Annie Horner had died. That was right outside her door. I saw it plain as day, and I never forgot that. We look at leprechauns, another familiar type of fairy. According to one of our other early sources, Dr. McAnally, the solitary nature of leprechauns is apparently intentional. Either their persistent reticence to the efforts of the scheming fairy mummers to marry him to young and beautiful fairies, leave them ostracized by fairy society, or they've learned the hollowness of fairy friendship and the deceitfulness of fairy femininity, and left the society of his own disgust at its lack of sincerity. So I think that maybe says a lot more about Dr. McAnally than it does about leprechauns. So we also hear about pects, and these are perhaps one of the types of fairy folk that people are less familiar with. The pects, he said, were low-set, heavy-made people, broad in the feet, so broad, he added, with an expressive gesture, that in the rain they could lie down and shelter themselves under their feet. So to contextualize this slightly more, pects are sort of mound builders. So these are different to the Pictish people, the people of sort of Scotland. These are a short, hairy man, normally dressed in animal skins, who would build the mounds. And places like Mount Sandal, in some stories, are said to have been built, the mound at Mount Sandal, are said to have been built by the Pictish people. Moving on to the center bit of the book, then, we look at ghosts. And that's both apparitions, which are visual manifestations, they can be transparent or monochrome or fully formed, sort of fully fleshed beings, or they can be poltergeists that have noise and movement without taking a visual form. Now, ghosts, I think, are the area where, within the stories that were shared in our reminiscence, there were more people who, they maybe didn't believe in ghosts, but they knew what they saw, right, in that sort of way. So they'd had experiences that they couldn't explain. And of course, Sam Henry recounts the same sort of feeling. The ghost, he says, was an emanation of the subconscious mind. But I still know people of education and reasoned belief who'd seen things that they can't account for. Okay. Rosemary McBride said that there was one I know from a Wake Garber area, someone I know personally. He was on his way home one day and he met a neighbor. He spoke to that neighbor and went on. And when he got home, he discovered that the neighbor had died that morning. So we get those stories quite often coming through. Margaret Huey told us, I remember, and this is no folklore, to me this was very real. Shortly after we got married, there was an old cottage, the roof came down with a slant, and I went up to bed, and I got into bed, and the next thing I seen was this old lady coming gliding out from the side of the window, or the wardrobe. And I remember that to this day as plain. She was dressed in brown with wee pin tucks down her dress and a high neck and wee pearly buttons on it, and her hair was back in a bun and it was frizzy hair at the side and a wee white cap on her head. And I just opened my mouth and squealed and she just disappeared into the head of the bed. And it's as clear to me this day it is. Fiona Milnes told various stories about her daughter's house. So she says, I know something about this. I don't know, there was something about the bungalow. I always got a very bad feeling about it, and it was always cold, no matter how much heat or anything you'd on. And whenever you walked down the hallway, there was like this mirror, at the end of the hallway. And for whatever reason, every time I walked down that hallway, I couldn't look in that mirror, because I just had this awful feeling. On 3 separate occasions, Catherine woke up in the middle of the night, and her TV in the living room was on. She had switched it off, and it just came on, but really, really loud, so it had. And then she went on. And there was my granddaughter, who was only 3 at the time, and they had a birthday party for her. Well, the next morning, after the birthday party, all her balloons were in a bedroom, and that particular bedroom was freezing cold like. And when they went into the next morning, every single balloon was burst. And Catherine said to her, why did you burst all your balloons? And she said, I didn't. She said, that man did. We found out afterwards that the man who'd owned the house before Catherine died in it, and he died in that bedroom where the Waynes slept. So there's a few of these stories that, you know, they do, even if you don't believe this sort of thing, they put a bit of a shiver down your spine. The final part of the book then explores the dark arts and the devils. And this, I suppose, is very much the shortest bit at the back of the book. There weren't so many stories, obviously contemporaneous stories, that came up to do with this. You'd all be familiar with the Island McGee witch trials of 1711. That's the last witch trials that took place on the island of Ireland. But they weren't the only witch trials up here in the north. On the 7th of May, 1703, John Craig and his daughter Betty were brought before the Presbyterian congregation of Causeway on the charge of witchcraft. Betty confessed that she was guilty of charming and of casting spells, but that her family was innocent. And according to the Causeway session book, she was rebuked thoroughly and dismissed. Okay? So it didn't always end with sort of hangings and court processes. Sam Henry recounts a story that in 1811, an old woman from the island of Islay put spells on the fishing of North Antrim. It was said that she had to be paid £2 2s to release the ban. Quite a few of the stories relate to a type of witch known across Ireland as a butter witch. And the idea of the butter witch was that she would transform herself into another shape, most often a hare, but sometimes a dog or a cat or a bird, and then would go and seek out farmers' cattle and then drain all the milk from the cattle before the farmer could get to them for milking. So one of the stories recorded by Jim Hunter, a man out hunting in the snow fired at a white hare, but only wounded it in the leg. As it fled, it left bright red bloodstains in the snow. The man followed the tracks until they ended at a little hut. Curious, he looked in the window and discovered that the hare had turned into an old woman who was sitting bathing her wounds. Mary Campbell said that there were witch women on Rathlin who would blink the cattle in the shape of a cat or a hare, and if you could shoot her with a silver coin, you'd be hearing tell next day that she was found lying. But kill her, you never could. So there's this idea that silver, again, is something that would, would be especially effective against witches, as it is traditionally against other sort of supernatural creatures. We then touch on devilry, and most of the devilry stories that we have seem to link to younger men who have been doing things that perhaps they shouldn't, and then the devil appears and they change their ways. So there's an account here from Jim Hunter. Coming home from playing cards late one night, a man from Ballykelly was about to cross a stile near his home when a man's arm reached out and would not allow him to pass. In despair, he tried to evade the clutching hand, but no matter where he went, the hand followed. He'd given up all hope of escaping when suddenly the church clock struck 12 and the hand vanished, allowing him to pass home without further incident. In the morning, after describing the event to his parents, the man's father and mother went out to the field where the incident had occurred and found numerous hoof tracks in the vicinity of the stile. On reporting their findings, the son immediately knew that it had been the devil, and he abandoned his ways. There were other stories, especially linked with Rathlin and with shipwrecks to do with devilry, but we also then sort of finish on stories of devilry where the devils are not really devils. So there's stories about people mistaking cattle for devils in the dark, owls for devils. But one of the ones where we spend a bit of time is looking at the so-called Devils of Ballycastle. And the Devils of Ballycastle were a statue group that stood above an archway overlooking the tennis courts on Mary Street, if you're familiar with Ballycastle. So the photograph here, these young ladies, they grew up within the courtyard of the Boyd Manor. This is the arch out of the courtyard of the Boyd Manor, and then that's the wall to the tennis courts just beyond them. And you can see at the top, this is the best photo that we have of these devils. We have the actual objects within Ballycastle Museum. We just don't have photographs of the front of them in situ. But all sorts of different superstitions attach themselves to these statues because they were seen as foreign and strange and sort of evil. So according to John Holbrook, it was never drawn attention to. That's what I would state. It was ignored, or else it was to do with evil or something like that. It was sinister. Raymond Bakewell reported that We always thought that it was the devil. Nobody ever told me. Everyone just regarded them as something to do with the devil. And then Peter Malloy said, we used to refer to it as the devils, as children. We were scared to go past it at night on our own because we were always told that's the devil from a very early age. And he thought that it was a way of scaring us off from places that we shouldn't have been in. We went on to do another project after the Law of the Land, specifically focused on the Devils of Ballycastle, where we looked at the history of the statues themselves. But we recorded probably from another half dozen, 8 more people who all reported these same ideas. People would come to these statues and they would cross the road and then walk past on the far side of the road, or they would spit to avert evil and then run past. As it turns out, there are statues we think that were actually inspired by one of the local gentry's time in India. And so a lot of the iconography on them relates to sort of that Indian sort of foreign strange motifs. But hopefully that has been a little bit of interest. It just gives you a taste of the sorts of stories that are in the book. It's well worth sitting down and having a read, especially on a cold sort of night. Snuggle up by your fireplace. Make sure you read late in the night. There are copies over at the tables, as I say. They're free. If you can't get a copy tonight, we have more within the museum itself. Or if you prefer your books digitally, it's also online and it can be downloaded as a PDF. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Special thanks, of course, to our guest speakers, Keith Beattie and Dr Nicholas Wright, for their excellent presentations tonight. Thank you both very much.